Harry Potter story, from another's perspective, Rowan Barrows and the Forgotten Prophecy, Chapter 8, Lessons and Errands. Rowan dreamt of shadows. They slid across the ground faster than his feet could follow, stretching long and thin between rows of trees. The forest around him seemed endless, trunks leaning inward as though listening, their leaves whispering words he almost understood but never quite caught. Somewhere ahead, there was a glow. It was faint, like the shimmer of moonlight caught in water, and no matter how quickly he ran, it never grew closer. Voices moved with it, soft, broken, drifting in and out like echoes down a long corridor. The ground seemed to give way beneath him. Rowan fell, down and down through the dark, until his eyes flew open and the dream shattered like mist. For a moment he lay still in his bed, heart hammering, listening to the quiet snores and shifting blankets of the other Hufflepuff boys. The dormitory was dim in the early morning light, the air cool and damp from the stone walls. The dream began to dissolve, as dreams always did. Rowan rubbed his face with the heels of his hands, chasing away the scraps of the strange dream. By the time he swung his legs over the side of the bed and padded across the stone floor, he had already forgotten it. He slipped out into the Hufflepuff common room. The room was still and golden in the early light, round walls hung with bright tapestries of plants and animals. Fat, squashy armchairs sat in warm clusters around low tables, and the scent potted herbs that lined the corners. The fire had burned low, just embers now, crackling faintly. Rowan thought he was the first one awake, until he noticed the third year that welcomed him. Cedric Diggory sitting in one of the chairs nearest the fire. The older boy had a book open on his knee, head bent in concentration, though he looked up as Rowan appeared. "You're up early," Cedric said with a half-smile, closing the book. "Couldn't sleep," Rowan admitted, shrugging. "New place and all?" Cedric nodded knowingly. "Takes a while to get used to the castle. Too many odd noises in the walls." Rowan managed a small grin and crossed the room, lowering himself into the armchair opposite. It felt strange sitting across from someone who seemed so at ease here, someone who belonged. Rowan still wasn't sure if he did. Cedric must have noticed the look on his face, because he said gently, "You'll find your place quicker than you think." He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms. "First day of lessons today?" Rowan nodded, trying not to look nervous. "I've got no idea what to expect. My dad said nothing about... Well, he never really explained how any of it works." "That's because half of it you've got to see for yourself," Cedric said lightly. Then, after a moment's thought, he added, "Best advice. Pay attention to Sprout. Some of the younger students think herbology's dull, but she's the kindest teacher here, and the things she shows you..." He tapped the cover of the book on his knee. "They'll save your skin in other classes." Cedric grinned and pushed himself to his feet, tucking the book under his arm. "Come on. Breakfast will be ready soon, and don't worry, by the end of today you'll already feel more at home." Cedric nodded toward the staircase. "Best get yourself ready. The others will be waking soon, and it's easier to face the first day together. Don't want to go wandering up to the Great Hall alone your first morning." Rowan nodded quickly. There was something about Cedric's calm tone that steadied him. A few minutes later, the dormitory was alive with movement. Ollie was loudly complaining that someone had stolen his socks. They were hanging from the end of his own bed. Justin Finch-Fletchley was carefully combing his hair, and Ernie Macmillan was already fretting about being late. Zachariah Smith just groaned into his pillow until Cedric called, "Come on, lads. Breakfast waits for no one." Together, the little knot of first years followed Cedric through the corridors. Rowan stayed close to Ollie, trying to remember each turn, but it was hopeless. Every wall looked the same, and the staircases creaked as though they might shuffle out of place at any moment. By the time they reached the Great Hall, Rowan felt both dazzled and relieved. The ceiling painted with a perfect imitation of the pale dawn sky. Long golden plates gleamed on the tables, and food appeared as though it had been waiting just for them. Baskets of toast, rashers of bacon, roasted tomatoes, steaming porridge, pitchers of milk and pumpkin juice. Rowan sat down between Ollie and Justin, blinking at the feast. It was only when Ollie elbowed him, grinning, that Rowan realised he'd been staring with his mouth slightly open. Rowan had only just managed to butter a slice of toast when a sudden rush of wings filled the great hall. He ducked instinctively as hundreds of owls swooped in through the high windows, flapping down toward the tables with all the elegance of a storm. "Post!" Ernie said eagerly, craning his neck upward. Rowan had seen owls delivering letters before, of course. Sebastian had carried more than a few between his parents' houses, but never so many at once. It was a dizzying blur of feathers and hoots, wings beating against the enchanted ceiling as letters and packages rained down onto the waiting students. One great tawny owl dropped a scroll into Ernie's porridge. A tiny screech owl nearly collided with Justin's head before veering off to the Ravenclaw table. And then Rowan saw him. Sebastian, his father's owl, swept low over the tables, his broad wings scattering a few napkins as he landed heavily on the Hufflepuff plates. He gave Rowan a haughty glare, clicked his beak, and extended one leg. Rowan untied the envelope quickly, trying not to notice Sebastian helping himself to Ollie's bacon. The letter was in his father's neat, slanted handwriting. "Rowan, I couldn't be prouder. I knew you'd do well. Another Barrows in Gryffindor, I bet. Just like the old days. I can only imagine the look on your face. Work hard, keep your head up, and remember you've got more grit than you think. I can't wait to hear all about it. Keep an eye on Sebastian. He's moody, but he'll always get the job done. All the best, son." Rowan read it twice. The noise of the great hall seemed to fade around him, the clatter of plates and chatter of students slipping into the distance. All he could see was his father's handwriting, steady, certain, as if the words had never doubted themselves for a moment. Another Barrows in Gryffindor. Rowan folded the letter slowly. Across the hall, the red and gold table was roaring with laughter. Rowan glanced down at the yellow and black sleeve of his robe. His chest tightened. What if he wasn't anything like his father after all? "You all right?" Cedric asked, leaning across the table. Rowan put away the letter carefully and nodded. "Yeah, Dad." Ollie snorted as Sebastian helped himself to yet another sausage. "Your dad's owl is a menace." But Rowan only half smiled. By the time the owls had finished delivering the post, Rowan realised that half the students in the Great Hall didn't seem particularly interested in breakfast. Instead, heads kept turning toward the Gryffindor table. Ernie Macmillan was standing slightly on his toes, craning his neck over the crowd. "Can you see him?" he whispered urgently. "Who?" Rowan asked, reaching for a slice of toast. Ernie looked at him as though he'd asked who Dumbledore was. "Harry Potter." Justin Finch-Fletchley had abandoned his porridge entirely and was leaning across the table beside him. Zachariah Smith gave an unimpressed sniff. "Yeah, but what does he actually look like?" Ernie leaned even further across the table, nearly knocking over a jug of pumpkin juice. "I think that's him," he said. "Messy hair, near the middle." Rowan found himself glancing over too. The Gryffindor table was packed shoulder to shoulder. A small knot of students gathered around one particular spot. He could just make out a boy with untidy black hair and glasses, looking slightly overwhelmed as people whispered and stared. "It must be strange," Rowan murmured. Justin nodded eagerly. "Imagine everyone knowing your name before you've even spoken." Ollie, meanwhile, had half climbed onto the bench to get a better look. "Move your elbow, Ernie," he muttered. "I can't see a thing." Cedric Diggory didn't even turn around. He calmly buttered a piece of toast and said quietly to Rowan, "Don't spend your first day worrying about someone else. Focus on getting through your own." Rowan hesitated, then nodded. Across the hall, the knot of students around Harry Potter was still buzzing with excitement. But Rowan turned back to his plate. After all, he had a whole castle to survive. Rowan's first week at Hogwarts passed in a blur of staircases, spells, and near disasters. If anyone had asked him on the train what he expected of magic school, he might have said flying lessons and adventure. He hadn't imagined so much homework. The castle itself seemed determined to confuse him. The staircases changed their minds every time he set foot on them. Portraits chatted at him when he tried to remember where the library was, and he could swear the suits of armour were moving. Charms was his first class on Monday morning, and Professor Flitwick began with Wingardium Leviosa. "Swish and flick," he said, standing on a pile of books so he could see over the desk. Ollie's feather went sailing gracefully into the air on his second try. Rowan's did nothing. "Excellent altitude," Ollie whispered. "Shame about the landing." By the end of the lesson, Flitwick had given Hufflepuff 5 points to Ollie. Transfiguration came next. Professor McGonagall turned her desk into a pig and back again, which earned a collective gasp. Rowan's matchstick wobbled and then burst into flames. McGonagall simply raised an eyebrow and tapped it back to normal. Herbology quickly became Rowan's favourite. Professor Sprout bustled about the greenhouse in her patched hat, handing out pairs of dragon-hide gloves that were 2 sizes too big. Rowan found he had a knack for coaxing even the most stubborn plants to behave. When he repotted a pufferpod seedling, its tiny leaves straightened, and Professor Sprout clapped her hands. "See here, class! Barrows has the touch." Potions, on the other hand, was a disaster from the first stir. Professor Snape's dungeon smelled faintly of rotten cabbage and bad moods. Rowan managed to spill salamander blood over his notes, while Ollie knocked over an entire jar of newt eyes. "Pathetic," Snape said in that silky voice of his. "I see Hufflepuff continues its proud tradition of mediocrity." Defence against the dark arts with Professor Quirrell was memorable only for the smell of garlic and the stammering every time the man said "vampire." He discovered the library was the warmest place in the castle, except for the spot right in front of the common room fire, where Ollie liked to practice important experiments, which usually meant seeing how long a chocolate frog could hop before melting. By Friday night, Rowan's robes were smudged with ink, his fingers stained from greenhouse soil, and his heart so full he could hardly believe this was only the beginning. As he lay in bed listening to the low crackle of the common room fire and the soft snores of his roommates, Rowan smiled to himself. He was tired, sore, occasionally singed, but he couldn't remember ever feeling so alive. Saturday morning dawned misty and pale, sunlight spilling through the castle windows in thin golden ribbons. Rowan was already up, determined to reach the library early, though after 15 minutes of walking, he was beginning to suspect the castle was conspiring against him. He stood at the intersection of 2 staircases that refused to stay still, frowning at the map Cedric had sketched for him on a napkin. The portraits were no help. "He's been past here 3 times already," sniffed a painted monk. "Perhaps he enjoys being lost," said another. Rowan folded Cedric's napkin map for the 15th time, feeling no closer to understanding Hogwarts than when he had started. Every stair seemed determined to move the moment he stepped on it. The corridors looped in impossible ways, and even the portraits were beginning to look pitying. Rowan sighed. "I'd like to at least pretend I know where I'm going." A dramatic clang echoed behind a tapestry to his left. "Halt, lost traveller!" Rowan jumped as the tapestry burst outward, and a ghost in dented, shimmering armour lurched into view. His helmet sat crooked on his head, his chainmail rattled like an overexcited wind chime, and his entire face gleamed with the wild delight of someone who had been waiting far too long for an audience. "I am Sir Garrick Fairweather," he announced proudly, thumping his dented chestplate. "The Grey Squire of Hogwarts, guardian of quests, seeker of noble deeds, assistant to great heroes." Rowan blinked. "Grey Squire?" "Indeed, a rank of immense promise," Sir Garrick declared, "like being a knight. Only I am not, officially knighted. Yet." He puffed out his translucent chest. "And you, good sir, appear in dire need of guidance." Rowan brightened. "Actually, I'm trying to find the library." Sir Garrick froze, completely. "The library," he repeated gravely, as if Rowan had asked him to lead an expedition to the moon. He spun in a slow, clanking circle. "Right. We should charge forth, or retreat, or possibly ascend a staircase, unless it's that staircase which once swallowed a student's shoe." Rowan's shoulders sagged. "So you don't know?" Sir Garrick hissed indignantly. "I know many things, just not where the library is." Before Rowan could say anything, a calm voice drifted up the staircase below. "If you're taking directions from him, you're going the wrong way." Rowan turned. A Ravenclaw girl was climbing toward them, dark hair plaited neatly, an armful of books tucked tight against her chest. Her smile was warm but amused. She couldn't have been more than a year older, but she carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had already mastered the maze. "First year?" she asked. "Is it that obvious?" Rowan said, trying not to sound sheepish. "Sir Garrick means well," she said, stepping beside Rowan, "but he gets lost quite often." The grey squire clutched at his chest. The girl ignored him gently. "He also introduces himself as Sir, even though he's still only a squire. He's been training for knighthood for centuries." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "And he is desperate for a quest. He'll latch onto anyone who looks even slightly confused." Rowan tried not to laugh. "Yeah, I see." The girl nodded toward the corridor. "Library's 2 floors up, left at the one-eyed witch statue." He hesitated. "Thanks. I'd have ended up in the owlery at this rate." "You're not far off," she replied. Her smile was warm but quick, like sunlight flashing through trees. "I'm Cho, by the way." "Rowan. Rowan Barrows." "Nice to meet you, Rowan Barrows." She shifted the books in her arms and started up the next staircase. "Good luck finding your way." Rowan watched her go until she disappeared around a corner. Then he turned back to the grey squire, smile on his face. Sir Garrick gave an extravagant bow. "Should you ever require a brave escort for perilous quests, call upon me." He tripped over his sword and vanished back through the tapestry with a pained clang. Rowan took the long way back to the Hufflepuff common room, partly because the castle seemed determined to test him, and partly because he didn't mind wandering anymore. He'd tucked the map Cedric gave him into his pocket, certain now that he could find his way by instinct, or at least by luck. The corridors were quieter this late in the afternoon. The portraits had grown drowsy, their colours fading slightly in the dimming light. Rowan walked a little slower, listening to his footsteps echo. And then, "Serpent wakes." He froze. The voice was low and hollow and gone almost as soon as he heard it. Rowan turned sharply, scanning the corridor. It was empty. The torches flickered weakly. He frowned, shaking his head. Maybe it was a portrait talking in its sleep. He started walking again. "When the shadows call." This time it was clearer, closer, as though someone had spoken just behind his shoulder. Rowan spun around. Nothing. Just the empty corridor stretching away into shadow. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He told himself it was just the castle playing tricks. Still, his chest felt tight as he turned the next corner a little faster. "The world shall see." Rowan broke into a near jog. He didn't stop until he saw the familiar barrels that hid the entrance to the Hufflepuff common room. The tension in Rowan's shoulders eased. He dropped into the nearest armchair by the fire. "You're jumpy," Ollie said, tossing him a chocolate frog. "Just the castle being weird," Rowan muttered, though his voice came out quieter than he meant. He looked into the fire for a long while after that, the flickering light painting gold across his face. He didn't hear any more voices that night, but he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been whispering to him. The next day the corridors hummed with their usual noise, the slap of shoes, the buzz of chatter, the occasional flash of Peeves swooping past on some mischievous errand. Rowan and Ollie were halfway down the marble staircase when Professor Sprout appeared at the landing below, balancing an armful of scrolls. "Ah, Mr. Barrows, Mr. Pennington," she called, smiling through the curls of parchment threatening to topple from her arms. "Perfect timing." Be dears and return these to Professor Binns for me, will you?" She shuffled a small stack of tightly rolled scrolls into Rowan's hands. Rowan glanced down at the faded titles written across the edges. "Invasive Creepers of the Northern Highlands. Magical Weeds and Their Spread. The Great Bramble Uprising of 1432. Rowan blinked. "Professor Binns, ma'am. The, ghost." Professor Sprout nodded cheerfully, as though asking them to return ancient scrolls to a ghost was the most ordinary thing in the world. Yes. I borrowed them for a bit of reading on invasive magical weeds. Fascinating little nuisances, some of them. Nearly overran half the greenhouses once, centuries ago." She patted the scrolls fondly. "Professor Binns keeps the most remarkable records." She balanced the rest of her parchment and added briskly, "He'll be in his classroom or somewhere near it. Just leave them on his desk and don't linger too long. I'd rather not have to fetch you back myself." Once she'd bustled away, Ollie turned to Rowan with an expression halfway between dread and curiosity. "Brilliant. A field trip to the land of eternal boredom." Rowan laughed under his breath. "I think that's his secret," Ollie whispered as they turned down the long history corridor, their footsteps echoing off the stone. "He died of boredom himself, and now he's passing it on." When they reached Professor Binns's door, it stood ajar. The faint sound of his droning voice seeped through, talking to an empty room. Something about the goblin rebellions of 1612. Ollie knocked politely, though it felt unnecessary. "Professor Binns?" Rowan called. "Professor Sprout sent us. We've brought back the scrolls she borrowed." The voice paused. Then, through the half-open door, the transparent figure of Professor Binns drifted slowly up from his desk, his edges shimmering faintly. "Oh, students," he said vaguely, as though unsure why that might be. Yes. Leave them on my desk." Rowan stepped inside and froze. He had never noticed how large the room truly was. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with maps, some parchment yellowed with age, others on thin sheets of vellum that seemed to hum faintly under the candlelight. Countries, empires, star charts. "Blimey," Ollie whispered, eyes wide. Professor Binns had already drifted back into his chair, muttering about goblins, entirely oblivious to their presence. Rowan placed the scrolls carefully on a desk piled high, with papers, and leaned closer to one of the maps. The ink shimmered faintly. Not black, but silver, curling like smoke along the edges of the parchment. "Come on," Ollie hissed, "before he wakes up and starts another lecture." They slipped back into the corridor, the door closing behind them with a soft creak. They were halfway down the corridor, still talking about Professor Binns, when they noticed a student dangling her legs from one of the staircase's turret above. "Oi! You're not supposed to be up there," Ollie called, craning his neck. Perched on the turret, legs swinging, a book open across her lap, sat a girl with ink-stained fingers and dark hair cut to her chin. She was watching one of the suits of armour that lined the corridor below, her quill scratching quickly across the page. "I'm not up there," she replied without looking. "The stairs move. I'm just waiting to see where they take me." Ollie raised his eyebrows at Rowan. "Right. Logical." The girl finally looked down at them. Her eyes were quick, not unfriendly, just sharp, like she noticed everything even when she wasn't trying to. "You're new to Hufflepuff as well," she said, studying them as though committing them to memory. Rowan squinted up at her for a moment, then recognition flickered across his face. "I know you. I saw you at the sorting ceremony," he said. "Margot, isn't it?" She smiled faintly and slid her quill neatly into the middle of her book before closing it. "You two went into Professor Binns's office," she said. "What for?" Rowan blinked. "Wait, how do you—" "He keeps the door open," she said simply, cutting Rowan off. "I like the sound of him rambling. He never stops talking." Ollie leaned against the banister, grinning. "You know, most people think he's the most boring thing in the castle." "Most people aren't listening properly," Margot replied. "He has some quite interesting stories." Rowan wasn't entirely convinced of that, but before he could think of anything to say, the staircase gave a sudden lurch. The turret began sliding slowly away from the landing. "Well?" Margot said, hopping lightly to her feet as the stairs started drifting toward another corridor. Better go. A moment later, the staircase carried her around the corner and out of sight. Ollie let out a low whistle. That, he said, might be the strangest person I've met all week. And that's saying something, considering we just delivered a scroll to a ghost. Ollie and Rowan stood in the corridor for a long moment after she'd gone, listening to the echo of her footsteps fade into the castle's endless turns and stairwells. "Well," Ollie said finally, adjusting his bag, "I suppose that's Hogwarts for you. Ghosts, talking portraits, and mysterious girls who think Professor Binns is interesting," Rowan laughed, the sound bouncing softly off the stone walls. "She might not be wrong, though," he said, glancing back at the staircase as it swung lazily toward another landing. Ollie gave him a mock look of alarm. "Don't start." They started walking again, the flickering torchlight painting the corridor golden shadow. The castle seemed quieter now, as if it was holding its breath, listening to their footsteps, when they finally reached the Hufflepuff common room. Rowan sat at one of the low tables near the hearth with a sheet of parchment and a quill. Sebastian had already been fed and had taken up residence on the back of a nearby chair, his golden eyes half-lidded as if judging Rowan's progress. Rowan dipped the quill in ink. For a moment he simply stared at the blank parchment. He had meant to write to his father first. The words from the other morning's letter drifted back into his mind. Another Barrows in Gryffindor, I bet. Rowan glanced down at the yellow and black sleeve of his robe. His chest tightened again. What would his father say when he found out? Instead, Rowan turned the parchment slightly and began again. "Mum, Hogwarts is brilliant. The castle's enormous. I still get lost half the time and the staircases move when they feel like it. I've already managed to set a matchstick on fire in Transfiguration." Professor McGonagall wasn't impressed. "But Professor Sprout says I've got a knack for herbology. I miss you, and Grandma too. Give Candy a scratch behind the ears for me. I hope Mrs. Perkins isn't giving you too much trouble. I'll write again soon." Rowan paused. The fire popped softly beside him. He added one last line. "Love, Rowan." He sat back for a moment, reading the letter over. It was true. All of it. Rowan folded the parchment carefully and tied it with a thin piece of twine. Sebastian opened one eye lazily as Rowan stood and tied the letter to his leg. Rowan watched the owl disappear up through the open window into the cool night air. For a moment he stood there, staring out at the dark sky above the castle towers. Then he turned back toward the warmth of the common room fire